My task today is really to set the context for the speakers to come by looking a little bit at the biodiversity, agriculture, and climate linkages. We know, of course, that biodiversity, or we can say nature, or life itself really, is facing an existential crisis. But biodiversity loss and climate change are really two sides of the same coin. Many of the root causes are the same, and we know that there is an urgent need for systemic and transformative change to address these root causes. I think the picture is very alarming. If we look at, the IPCC special report of 2018 on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, they say with high confidence that human activities have caused 1 degree of warming relative to pre-industrial levels, increasing at 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade. We know this will have a tremendous impact on biodiversity, leading to changes in species distribution, population sizes, reproduction, migration, and really collapse in our natural systems. And already we see a large amount of threatened mammals and birds already negatively affected. Then we had the IPBES global assessment. Lynn touched on this briefly yesterday, which already showed that about 1 million species are facing extinction. And we have very alarming figures: 47% decrease in ecosystem extent and condition, 75% of land surface significantly altered, 66% of ocean areas experiencing increasing impacts. And we have already lost more than 85% of our wetlands. Now, if this doesn't jolt us into urgent action, I don't know what else can. Unfortunately, as also touched on yesterday, the Global Biodiversity Outlook was really based on the reporting of parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. None of the IG targets will be fully achieved by the end of this year. And we see that even though governments have put in place policies and actions to support biodiversity, these are not addressing the real drivers of biodiversity loss, the real root causes, and we are in an even worsening state. So agriculture, of course, is intimately linked to all of this because the IPCC points out that the agri-food system is responsible for up to 37% of total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, with up to 28% corresponding to agriculture and land use. And IPBES also called out land use change for agriculture as a major driver of habitat and biodiversity loss. Of course, we have to ask the question, but which agri-food system is driving biodiversity loss and causing climate change? And the answer, of course, is that it's really the industrial food and agriculture system. Now, knowing all this, where are the solutions? We know that biodiversity plays a critical role in addressing climate change. It contributes to resilience and adaptation, as well as mitigation by acting as carbon sinks. Because yes, ecosystems can play important roles in sequestering carbon. And these ecosystems, such as forests, grasslands, and wetlands, play very important roles. And when we look at agriculture, we know that peasant agroecology also enhances biodiversity. It is based on biodiversity at all levels: genetic, species, and ecosystems level. In fact, agroecology is an ecosystem-based approach because its territorial and landscape approach actually protects critical ecosystem. Agroecology also removes a major driver of biodiversity loss, which is pollution from pesticides. It helps farmers adapt to climate change, it increases resilience, and we see this. We've seen examples of this, for example, agroecological farms in Central America that not only withstand the shock of hurricanes, but recover much faster than when compared to conventional farms. And Tammy will talk a lot more about agroecology. I wanted to just flag this. It also mitigates climate change through avoided emissions, through the non-use of synthetic fertilizers, for example, and sequester carbon through enhancing organic matter in the soil. So agroecology is really, I would say, a good example of biodiversity and agriculture coming together. And this is just a picture of a friend's farm in Western India. It's a farm in the forest. So having known all this, what do we need to do? And what is the necessary action we must take? I think the first priority really is on protecting terrestrial and marine ecosystems and agroecologically managed systems. But we have to do this hand in hand with protecting the rights of the communities who inhabit, protect, and manage these ecosystems. We can't just protect ecosystems without protecting the rights of the people who are living there, managing and sustainably using and conserving biodiversity. When we do this, then we will protect the critical ecosystem functions that these ecosystems provide. And such ecosystem-based approaches also, at the same time, contribute to climate regulation, both mitigation and adaptation. Just to segue a little bit, to just reiterate that the IPBES report last year confirmed that biodiversity is declining less rapidly in land managed by indigenous peoples. And they, together with a diverse array of local communities, including farmers, fishers, herders, hunters, forest users, are really at the forefront of biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. And therefore, it's absolutely critical, as I said, that we need to respect, protect, and fulfill their rights. And in particular, of course, securing community land rights is critical, not just for biodiversity and food security, but it is also an effective, efficient, and equitable climate action. When lands and forests are community managed, there is no deforestation. And this avoided deforestation actually protects the equivalent of over 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide as carbon stocks in and under these lands and territories. And yet, while half of the world's land is associated with customary land use, only 10% is legally under IPLC ownership. So this is a major gap that needs to be addressed. Now, what about the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework? How do we address these issues? We've already heard that, we will be talking much more today about the whole issue of nature-based solutions. And the approach that the CBD has long taken is to look at ecosystem-based approach, about protecting, conserving, and sustainably using ecosystems. This is now actually being, I would say, hijacked by nature-based solutions. Of course, it's important to protect biodiversity for many reasons, including for addressing climate change. But nature-based solutions linked to climate mitigation, is being used to say that the carbon sequestering possibilities of nature can compensate or offset for continued burning of fossil fuels. This obscures the urgent need to stop fossil fuel emissions. We must learn to separate genuine, real solutions that depend on nature, such as agroecology, from false solutions, such as carbon offsets. The second issue, and we discussed it slightly yesterday as well, is on rights-based approaches. Now, yes, rights-based approaches are recognized in the theory of change that precedes the actual global biodiversity framework. However, what really matters is the language that's in the framework, because this is what governments will then be obligated to implement. I think we need to question very seriously whether they are only paying lip service to the issue of rights-based approaches. We heard yesterday, and we'll hear again today, that we cannot continue conserving and protecting biodiversity without this parallel process of protecting the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. The third point, agroecology, as we heard yesterday, there is a target on agricultural biodiversity in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This is still needs to be strengthened strongly, but we can't have it just in one target, and it should cross-cut many of the other targets, because it is a holistic approach that contributes to many issues: climate change mitigation, and adaptation and resilience, livelihoods, nutrition, etc. Tammy will talk a lot more about this in the last talk. Another point that has come up strongly in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is the issue of mainstreaming. And this is, of course, very important, because mainstreaming means that we are addressing the very sectors that are responsible for biodiversity loss, including industrial agriculture. However, we have to be alert to the fact that it could be captured by corporates. So I would say that if we have mainstreaming in the post-2020 biodiversity framework, and as a key plank of the CBD, this has to go hand in hand with the requisite policy and regulatory measures to regulate corporations. And this, of course, applies also to the issue of sustainable production and consumption. again, a root cause of biodiversity loss and climate change. And there is, of course, a target dealing with this. However, we cannot depend on voluntary approaches anymore, but we really need to have regulatory measures to change the incentives and remove the subsidies for activities that cause harm to biodiversity. I just want to step back a little bit more to look at a little bit of the links between the CBD and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and why this matters. We will talk a lot more today about nature-based solutions. And if we allow this issue to come into the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, I think we can be fairly sure that this will be harvested at the UNFCCC. There is a link to net zero goals, which many governments and corporations have pledged. But net actually means the continuation of polluting as normal, while relying on the notion that the carbon release will be sucked out of the air by other means, including through nature, in some other country done by someone else entirely. And this is, of course, linked to carbon offsets and markets. Carbon trading schemes really mean business as usual, because you can still claim to be on track for net zero emissions. And the door has been already opened in the Paris Agreement for the establishment of an international carbon market. But the rules could not be agreed at the last COP meeting last year. So if things are secured within the CBD and a foothold is made for nature-based solutions, this will definitely be taken up and brought into the UNFCCC. And I think we can see that in the sequencing of the meetings, because the China COP next year is going to come earlier than the COP, UNFCCC COP in the UK. And really, I think a departure point is also actually tomorrow with the UN Biodiversity Summit that opens tomorrow as part of the General Assembly. And already we see that the leaders pledge to this Biodiversity Summit talks very much about recognizing the business case for biodiversity, commitments to significant scale up of nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches. Now, of course, putting both of these concepts together doesn't negate the fact that the door is open for nature-based solutions. So we have to be careful about that, because that's also currently in the zero draft of the post-2020 framework. Finally, the leaders are also pledging to the objective, commit to the objective of net zero greenhouse gas emissions. So I think we need to understand this geopolitical context of where the issue is coming from. And I think Doreen, Matthew and Steph will go much more into this and the real agendas behind this term, which sounds innocuous at the surface. So I think I'll just stop here by sharing this last slide. It's quite an old cartoon. I think it's appropriate for both the issue of biodiversity loss and climate change. And I think what we need now is real action to focus on real solutions, such as agroecology and other ecosystem-based approaches, and to move away from the false solutions, such as carbon offsets, which will allow the continuation of business as usual. Thank you very much.